World War II from 1939 to 1945. Introduction and causes. World War II is the largest and most devastating conflict in human history. It began on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, which led the United Kingdom and France to declare war on Germany. Several factors contributed to the outbreak of the war, including the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. The harsh penalties imposed on Germany after its defeat in World War I led to widespread resentment and a desire for revenge. The rise of fascism and Nazism. Fascist powers like Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Nazi Germany sought to expand their territories and implement aggressive expansionist policies. The Great Depression. The global economic downturn led to social unrest and the rise of totalitarian regimes promising to restore national pride and economic stability. Major parties involved. Axis powers, the aggressor nations, Germany, Italy and Japan. Allied powers, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union after being invaded by Germany in 1941, and the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Key phases of the war. The German invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the official start of the war. This aggressive move by Germany led to a swift and brutal campaign, resulting in the rapid fall of Poland. The invasion prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, setting the stage for a global conflict. The Battle of France in 1940, Germany invaded France, leading to the fall of Paris in June 1940. The swift and decisive German victory, known as the Blitzkrieg, overwhelmed French defences and forced the French government to surrender. This marked a significant turning point in the war, as Germany now controlled much of Western Europe. North Africa and the Middle East campaigns. Axis and Allied forces clashed in North Africa with major battles like El Alamein. The harsh desert conditions and strategic importance of the region made these campaigns crucial. The Allied victory at El Alamein in 1942 marked a turning point, halting the Axis advance and beginning a pushback that would eventually lead to the liberation of North Africa. The Pacific War from 1941 to 1945. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war. This surprise attack aimed to cripple the US Pacific Fleet, but it ultimately galvanized American resolve, leading to a fierce and prolonged conflict across the Pacific Islands. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, initially made significant advances but ultimately failed, particularly at the Battle of Stalingrad from 1942 to 1943. The brutal winter and fierce Soviet resistance turned the tide, marking a significant defeat for Germany and a turning point on the Eastern Front. The US attacks on Japan. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945. These bombings brought a devastating end to the war in the Pacific, showcasing the destructive power of nuclear weapons and ushering in a new era of warfare and international relations. Results and effects. The war caused an estimated 70 million deaths, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. The war dramatically altered the political landscape of the world, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as superpowers. Created in 1945 to prevent future wars, the United Nations was formed. After the war, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union led to the Cold War. World War I from 1914 to 1918 was devastating. World War I, also known as the Great War, was the first total war of the modern era. It involved nations from across the globe and resulted in unprecedented levels of destruction and loss of life. It began on July 28, 1914, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. This event triggered a series of diplomatic crises and mobilizations. However, several underlying causes contributed to the war's outbreak. These causes have been building up over many years, creating a volatile environment. Military alliances. Major European powers had formed military alliances such as the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, Britain and Russia. These alliances were meant to provide security, but instead created a web of obligations. These alliances meant that any local conflict could escalate into a full-scale war. A small spark could ignite a massive blaze, drawing in multiple nations. Colonial rivalries. European powers were competing for colonies in Africa and Asia, leading to tensions. The quest for global dominance and resources added fuel to the fire. Arms race and technology. The rapid increase in military spending and technological advancements, like machine guns and heavy artillery, set the stage for a more destructive war. Nations were eager to showcase their military prowess. Strong nationalist sentiments, particularly in the Balkans, were a catalyst for the conflict. National pride and the desire for independence created a powder keg situation ready to explode at any moment. The Allies. The United Kingdom, France, Russia until 1917, Italy joined in 1915, and the United States joined in 1917. The Central Powers Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The Western Front. The war on the Western Front was characterized by trench warfare, where both sides dug extensive networks of trenches. Major battles included the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and the Battle of Verdun in 1916. The Eastern Front, fighting between Germany and Austria-Hungary against Russia. In 1917, Russia withdrew from the war after the Bolshevik Revolution. The US entry in 1917, the United States joined the war on the side of the Allies, tipping the balance in favor of the Entente. End of the war. The war ended with the signing of the Armistice of Compiègne on November 11, 1918, and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which officially ended the conflict. Human losses. An estimated 15 million people died, including 7 million civilians. The sheer scale of the devastation was unprecedented, leaving countless families shattered and communities in mourning. The loss of life was not just a statistic, but a profound human tragedy that echoed through generations. The war also caused massive physical and psychological trauma. Soldiers returned home with severe injuries, both visible and invisible. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded, and the psychological scars, such as PTSD, haunted many for the rest of their lives. Civilians too bore the brunt of the war, living in war-torn cities and dealing with the trauma of loss and destruction. The collapse of empires. The war led to the collapse of empires, including the Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian and German empires. These collapses reshaped the political landscape of Europe and the Middle East, leading to a period of instability and the emergence of new nations and political ideologies. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The treaty imposed heavy penalties on Germany, which led to economic hardship and political instability, contributing to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The harsh terms of the treaty created a sense of humiliation and resentment among the German people, setting the stage for future conflict. Political reorganization. The map of Europe was redrawn and new countries were formed, including Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. This redrawing of borders aimed to create a more stable and balanced Europe, but it also led to new tensions and conflicts as different ethnic and national groups sought self-determination. Both wars were monumental in shaping the 20th century and had lasting effects on the global order. The aftermath of these conflicts led to significant changes in international relations, economic policies, and social structures. The reconstruction efforts post-war also paved the way for technological advancements and shifts in global power dynamics. World War I set the stage for many of the problems that led to World War II, and the aftermath of both wars significantly altered the political, economic, and social structures of nations worldwide. The interwar period was marked by economic depression and political instability, which contributed to the rise of totalitarian regimes. The global changes post-World War II, including the establishment of the United Nations, aimed to prevent such widespread conflict in the future and promote international cooperation.
The Vietnam War was a long and complex conflict between North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies. The war began in an indirect form in 1955, when Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam following France's defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Vietnam War was part of the broader Cold War conflict between communist and capitalist powers. Political and military division. After France's defeat, Vietnam was divided into North and South by the Geneva Accords of 1954. The North was under communist rule led by Ho Chi Minh, while the South was under a non-communist government supported by the United States. Spread of communism. The West, led by the United States, feared the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This fear was part of the broader strategy of containment to prevent the expansion of communism. The Cold War. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union led both countries to intervene in the Vietnam conflict, with the United States supporting the South and the Soviet Union and China supporting the North. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh with significant support from the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, supported by the United States and its allies. The United States initially provided military and economic aid to South Vietnam and later escalated its involvement by sending large numbers of ground troops after 1965. The Viet Cong, a guerrilla group in the south supported by the North, who fought against the South Vietnamese government and American forces. Phases of the war. Phase 1 from 1955 to 1964. The war was indirect, with the United States supporting the South against insurgencies led by the Viet Cong. Phase 2 from 1965 to 1968. The United States began a massive military escalation following the Tet Offensive of 1968, a surprise attack by North Vietnamese forces on major South Vietnamese cities. This marked a turning point in the war, making it one of the deadliest. Phase 3, from 1969 to 1973. The United States began withdrawing its forces gradually following the Paris peace talks in 1973, which resulted in a ceasefire agreement between the warring parties. Phase 4, from 1974 to 1975. Despite the withdrawal of United States troops, the war continued between North and South Vietnam, culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975, leading to the reunification of the country under communist rule. Results and impact. Human losses. Around 3 million people died in the war, including more than 58,000 United States soldiers and millions of civilians. Economic and environmental devastation. The war caused extensive economic damage to Vietnam, as well as severe environmental destruction from the use of toxic substances like Agent Orange. Political consequences. North Vietnam's victory led to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, which had a significant impact on global politics, reinforcing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Impact on the United States. The war caused a significant decline in public trust in the United States government, leading to widespread anti-war protests and a reassessment of United States foreign policy. Cultural impact. The Vietnam War became a central theme in United States culture, reflected in literature, films and music, leading to debates on war and politics.
The Iraq War began in March 2003. A US-led coalition launched an invasion. Their target was the regime of Saddam Hussein. This marked the start of a protracted and bloody conflict. The invasion swiftly toppled Hussein's government. However, it also unleashed chaos and instability. This instability would plague Iraq for years to come. The war's legacy continues to shape the Middle East today. It stands as a stark reminder of the devastating costs of conflict. The decision to invade Iraq was highly controversial. Many argued that the justifications for war were flawed. Others questioned the long-term strategy. The aftermath of the invasion saw the rise of sectarian violence. It also created a power vacuum that allowed extremist groups to flourish. The Iraq War had a profound impact on the lives of millions. It also reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Understanding the causes, phases, and consequences of this conflict is crucial. The Bush administration offered several justifications for the invasion of Iraq. These justifications centered around the following: the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, the alleged existence of weapons of mass destruction, and potential ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. The administration argued that Hussein was a brutal dictator. He posed a threat to his own people and to regional stability. They claimed he was developing weapons of mass destruction that could be used against the United States or its allies. The administration also suggested that Hussein might provide support to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. However, the intelligence used to justify the war proved to be deeply flawed. No stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. The alleged ties between Hussein and Al-Qaeda were tenuous at best. In the years since the invasion, many have argued that the Bush administration exaggerated the threat posed by Iraq. Critics contend that the war was driven by other motives. These motives include a desire to control Iraqi oil reserves and to reshape the Middle East in America's image. The debate over the justifications for the Iraq War remains highly contentious. It continues to fuel discussions about the use of American military power. The Iraq War involved a complex web of actors. Each had their own motivations and objectives. The primary belligerents were the US-led coalition and the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein. However, numerous other groups played significant roles in the conflict. The US-led coalition consisted of troops from over 30 countries. The United States provided the vast majority of the military force. The coalition's stated goal was to remove Saddam Hussein from power. They also aimed to prevent him from using weapons of mass destruction and to establish a democratic government in Iraq. Saddam Hussein's government represented a Ba'athist ideology. This ideology combined elements of Arab nationalism and socialism. Hussein maintained a tight grip on power through a combination of repression and patronage. He relied on a loyal military and intelligence apparatus to suppress dissent. Numerous armed groups also participated in the conflict. These included Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, Shiite militias, and Sunni insurgents. These groups had a range of motivations. Some sought to resist the US-led occupation. Others aimed to advance their own sectarian or political agendas. The complex interplay between these various actors contributed to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the Iraq War. Section 4. Phases of conflict, invasion, insurgency, and withdrawal. The Iraq War can be divided into three phases: the initial invasion in 2003, the insurgency from 2003 to 2006, and the withdrawal from 2007 to 2011. The invasion was swift and decisive. US-led forces captured Baghdad quickly. Saddam Hussein was captured and executed. The power vacuum led to a widespread insurgency. Various armed groups launched attacks against coalition forces and civilians. In 2007, the US surged additional troops to quell the violence. The last US combat troops left Iraq in December 2011, ending the war. Section 5. The human cost. A generation scarred. The Iraq War exacted a devastating toll on human life and left deep scars on Iraqi society. While precise figures remain elusive, estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives as a direct result of the conflict. The war's brutality extended beyond battlefield casualties. Countless civilians perished in suicide bombings, sectarian violence, and crossfire between warring factions. The conflict displaced millions more, creating a humanitarian crisis within Iraq and straining resources in neighboring countries. The psychological impact of the war on the Iraqi people is immeasurable. Years of violence and instability left many traumatized and struggling to cope. The war shattered families, disrupted education, and eroded trust in institutions. The human cost of the Iraq War serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of armed conflict. The war's legacy continues to haunt Iraq, casting a long shadow over the country's future. Section 6. Political and economic fallout. A reshaped Middle East. The Iraq War had profound political and economic consequences for Iraq and the broader Middle East. The war toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, but failed to deliver on promises of stability and democracy. Following the invasion, the United States attempted to establish a democratic system in Iraq. However, these efforts were hampered by widespread corruption, sectarian violence, and a lack of consensus on a new political order. The war exacerbated existing ethnic and religious tensions, fueling a cycle of violence that continues to this day. Economically, the war devastated Iraq's infrastructure and crippled its oil industry. Years of conflict and instability discouraged foreign investment and hindered reconstruction efforts. The war also diverted valuable resources away from essential services, hindering Iraq's ability to rebuild. Regionally, the war had a destabilizing effect, empowering Iran and contributing to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. The power vacuum created by the toppling of Hussein's regime allowed Iran to expand its influence in Iraq. Additionally, the chaos and instability created fertile ground for the emergence of ISIS, which seized control of large swathes of territory in Iraq and Syria. The Iraq War's political and economic fallout continues to reverberate throughout the Middle East, shaping the region's geopolitical landscape and posing significant challenges to peace and stability. Section 7. Global consequences. The rise of extremism and shifting alliances. The Iraq War had far-reaching global consequences, shaping international relations and fueling the rise of extremism. One of the most significant consequences was the rise of ISIS. The group exploited the chaos in Iraq to establish a foothold and recruit followers. The war strained relations between the United States and its allies. Many countries opposed the invasion, arguing it was illegal and unjustified. The war's high human cost tarnished America's image abroad. The Iraq War stands as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of military intervention. The Afghan War, spanning from 1979 to 1989, remains a stark reminder of the Cold War's global reach. This brutal conflict, often dubbed the Soviet Union's Vietnam, witnessed a superpower entangled in a fierce battle against resilient guerrilla fighters. The Afghan War's consequences were far-reaching, contributing to the Soviet Union's decline and shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. Understanding this conflict requires delving into its causes, the key players involved, and the devastating impact it left on Afghanistan and the world. The Soviet invasion in 1979 transformed Afghanistan into a battleground of ideologies and proxy warfare. The United States, locked in a global struggle against Soviet communism, saw an opportunity to bleed its adversary. Meanwhile, the Afghan people, caught in the crossfire, endured immense suffering and displacement as their country became a chessboard for superpowers. This conflict's legacy continues to resonate, serving as a cautionary tale about the human cost of Cold War rivalries and the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. The Afghan War's impact on regional stability, the rise of radical ideologies, and the plight of Afghan refugees are just a few of the enduring reminders of this tumultuous period. The roots of the Afghan War trace back to the fragile political landscape of the 1970s. In 1973, a coup overthrew the monarchy, installing Mohammed Daoud Khan as leader. Khan sought modernization through closer ties with the Soviet Union. His secular policies alienated conservative elements. Discontent fueled the rise of Islamic groups, including the communist PDPA. In 1978, the PDPA, backed by the Soviets, staged the Tsar Revolution, overthrowing Khan. The PDPA's power grab ignited fierce resistance, leading to a protracted conflict. Alarmed by instability, the Soviet Union intervened militarily, sparking a decade-long war. The Afghan war drew in a complex web of actors, each with their own motives. On one side stood the Soviet Union, determined to prop up the Afghan communist regime. The Red Army faced a formidable challenge in the rugged Afghan terrain. Facing them were the Mujahideen, united by their opposition to the Soviet occupation. These fighters employed guerrilla tactics, ambushing Soviet convoys. The US provided covert support to the Mujahideen through Operation Cyclone. Billions of dollars worth of weapons, including Stinger missiles, were funneled to the Afghan resistance. Pakistan, under General Zia, provided training and logistical support. Other regional actors played significant roles, shaping the course of the war. Section 4. A war in 3 acts, from intervention to withdrawal. The Afghan war unfolded in 3 distinct phases, each marked by shifting dynamics on the battlefield and evolving strategies. The initial phase, from 1979 to 1982, witnessed the swift Soviet invasion and the establishment of a puppet government in Kabul. Soviet forces secured major cities and communication routes, but faced mounting resistance in the countryside. The second phase, spanning from 1983 to 1986, witnessed an intensification of the conflict. The Mujahideen, bolstered by foreign support and increasingly effective guerrilla tactics, inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces. The Soviet army, bogged down in a protracted war with no end in sight, resorted to brutal tactics, including the use of landmines and scorched earth policies, further alienating the Afghan population. The final phase, from 1987 to 1989, marked a turning point. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union, facing mounting economic woes and domestic pressure, sought a way out of the Afghan quagmire. Gorbachev initiated a policy of national reconciliation and began withdrawing Soviet troops. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier left Afghan soil, marking the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. Section 5, Afghanistan in ruins, the war's devastating toll. The Afghan War left an indelible scar on Afghanistan, a country already grappling with poverty and underdevelopment. The conflict resulted in widespread destruction of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals. Agriculture, the backbone of the Afghan economy, was devastated, leaving millions facing food shortages. The human cost of the war was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million Afghans lost their lives during the conflict, with millions more injured or displaced. The war created a massive refugee crisis, as millions fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran, straining resources and creating long-term humanitarian challenges. The war's impact on Afghan society was profound. The conflict exacerbated ethnic and tribal divisions, fueling future conflicts and instability. The war also left a legacy of violence and trauma, with generations of Afghans bearing the psychological scars of war. The proliferation of weapons and the emergence of warlordism further hampered efforts at rebuilding and reconciliation. Section 6. Echoes of a distant war, global and regional consequences. The Afghan war's repercussions extended far beyond Afghanistan's borders, leaving a lasting impact on the global stage. For the Soviet Union, the war proved to be a costly miscalculation. The conflict drained Soviet resources, exposed the Red Army's vulnerabilities, and fueled domestic discontent with the communist regime. The Afghan quagmire contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse in 1991, marking the end of the Cold War. The war also had significant implications for the United States. The US emerged from the conflict as a victor, having successfully supported the Afghan resistance and contributed to the Soviet Union's decline. However, the war's legacy was a double-edged sword. The US support for the Mujahideen, some of whom would later form the Taliban, had unintended consequences. The war created a breeding ground for radical ideologies and armed groups, setting the stage for future conflicts in the region, including the rise of Al-Qaeda and the subsequent US intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. Section 7. Conclusion: a legacy of conflict and its lessons. The Afghan War stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of Cold War rivalries and the enduring consequences of foreign intervention. The conflict left Afghanistan devastated, its people grappling with the scars of war, displacement, and a legacy of violence. The war's impact on the Soviet Union contributed to its demise, while the United States grappled with the unintended consequences of its support for the Afghan resistance. The Afghan War offers valuable lessons for the international community. It highlights the dangers of proxy wars, the importance of understanding local dynamics in conflict zones, and the need for sustainable solutions to address the root causes of conflict. The war's legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of foreign intervention and the enduring human cost of conflict.
The sun beat down mercilessly on the African veld, casting long shadows over the dry grasslands. The year was 1899, and the winds of war were stirring, carrying with them the scent of conflict and change. In the heart of what is now South Africa, two different worlds were about to collide, each with its own vision for the future. This was the beginning of the Second Boer War, a conflict that would pit the might of the British Empire against the tenacity of the Boer republics, testing the limits of both. At stake was the control of precious resources, namely gold and diamonds, recently discovered within the Boer territories, treasures that promised immense wealth and power. But it was also a clash of ideologies, of empires old and new, of ways of life that seemed increasingly incompatible as the world stood on the brink of a new century. The discovery of gold in the Transvaal, a Boer republic in the 1880s, had ignited the ambitions of Cecil Rhodes, a staunch imperialist and Prime Minister of the Cape Colony who dreamed of a British-dominated Africa. Rhodes envisioned a British-controlled Africa, a vision that put him on a collision course with the Boers, who were determined to maintain their independence. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had arrived in South Africa in the 17th century, were fiercely independent, valuing their autonomy above all else. They had carved out their own republics in the African interior, determined to live by their own laws and traditions, far from the reach of British influence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for South Africa, but for the entire British Empire. The Boers, though outnumbered and outgunned, were skilled marksmen and tacticians, deeply familiar with the rugged terrain, which they used to their advantage. The British, confident in their superior numbers and resources, underestimated the Boers' resolve and their intimate knowledge of the land. This miscalculation would cost them dearly in the early stages of the war, as the Boers' guerrilla tactics and fierce resistance took a heavy toll on British forces, reshaping the course of the conflict. The British Empire, at the zenith of its power, boasted a vast empire on which the sun never set. Its reach extended across continents, influencing cultures, economies, and politics worldwide. Its military, renowned for its discipline and organization, was drawn from across the globe. Soldiers from various colonies and dominions came together under the Union Jack, creating a diverse yet unified force. Red-coated soldiers from England, Scotland, and Ireland fought alongside volunteers from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. This blend of cultures and backgrounds was a testament to the Empire's vast reach and influence. They were armed with the latest weaponry, including magazine rifles and artillery, confident in their technological superiority. The British military prided itself on its advanced equipment and strategic prowess. The Boers, on the other hand, were citizen soldiers, farmers, and hunters who answered the call to arms. Their motivation was deeply personal, driven by a desire to protect their land and way of life. They wore no uniforms, favoring their everyday clothes of khaki and slouch hats. This practical attire allowed them to blend seamlessly into their surroundings, making them formidable opponents in guerrilla warfare. What they lacked in formal military training, they made up for in their marksmanship, their guerrilla tactics, and their intimate knowledge of the veldt. Their ability to navigate and utilize the terrain gave them a significant advantage. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. This personal stake in the conflict fueled their determination and resilience. The contrast between the two armies was stark. On one side, a professional, well-equipped force, on the other, a determined, resourceful group of citizen soldiers. The British, a professional army fighting for Queen and Empire, represented a modern, industrialized world. Their military might was a reflection of the Empire's technological and industrial advancements. The Boers, fighting for their independence and their very survival, embodied a simpler, more agrarian way of life. Their connection to the land and their traditional lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the British. This clash of cultures, of values, would be a defining feature of the war. It was not just a battle for territory, but a struggle between two very different ways of life, each fighting for its own vision of the future. The early months of the war belonged to the Boers. Skilled marksmen armed with Mauser rifles, they inflicted heavy casualties on the British, who were accustomed to fighting in close formations. The Boers, operating in small, highly mobile units, exploited the terrain to their advantage, ambushing British columns and besieging key towns. The sieges of Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith became early symbols of Boer resistance. Outnumbered and outgunned, Boer forces held off larger British forces for weeks, capturing the imagination of the world. Newspapers around the globe carried stories of Boer bravery and British setbacks, shaking the confidence of the Empire. These early victories had a profound impact on the Boers. A sense of invincibility, perhaps even overconfidence, began to take hold. They had taken on the might of the British Empire and emerged victorious, at least for now. This belief would have significant consequences as the war progressed. Section 4. The Tide Turns, British Might and Boer Resilience. The British, stung by their early defeats, poured more troops and resources into South Africa. Field Marshal Lord Roberts, a veteran commander, arrived to take charge of the British forces. Under his leadership, the British Army adopted new tactics, relying on their superior firepower and logistics to wear down the Boers. The tide began to turn. British forces relieved the besieged towns of Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith. Boer forces, unable to withstand the overwhelming British numbers and firepower, began to retreat. In June 1900, Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal, fell to the British, dealing a severe blow to Boer morale. Despite these setbacks, the Boers refused to surrender. They abandoned conventional warfare, melting away into the vastness of the veld. The war entered a new phase, one characterized by guerrilla raids and hit-and-run tactics. The Boers, now fighting for their very survival, proved to be a tenacious and resourceful enemy. Section 5. A war of attrition, scorched earth and concentration camps. The war dragged on, becoming a bitter and brutal struggle with no end in sight. Both sides were entrenched in a relentless conflict that seemed to consume everything in its path. The Boers, operating in small mobile units, continued to harass British forces, disrupting their supply lines and inflicting casualties. Their knowledge of the local terrain gave them a significant advantage in these skirmishes. The British, frustrated by their inability to crush the Boer resistance, resorted to increasingly harsh measures. Their traditional military tactics were proving ineffective against the guerrilla warfare employed by the Boers. To deprive the Boers of food and shelter, the British implemented a scorched earth policy, burning farms and crops and confiscating livestock. This strategy aimed to starve the Boer fighters into submission by destroying their means of sustenance. Thousands of Boer women and children, left homeless and destitute, were herded into concentration camps. These camps were intended to isolate the civilian population from the guerrilla fighters. These camps, overcrowded and unsanitary, became breeding grounds for disease. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care led to widespread illness. Thousands, particularly children, perished from malnutrition and disease. The conditions in the camps were dire, with insufficient food and medical supplies exacerbating the suffering. The use of concentration camps and the scorched earth policy remain highly controversial aspects of the war. These measures were seen by many as extreme and inhumane, sparking outrage and condemnation. They are seen by many as dark stains on the British Empire's record, testaments to the brutality of the conflict. The harsh tactics employed during the war left a lasting legacy of bitterness and resentment. The suffering endured in these camps would have a lasting impact on the Afrikaner psyche, shaping their perceptions of the British and fueling resentment for generations to come. The trauma and loss experienced during this period became a defining moment in Africana history, influencing their cultural and political identity.